I'm going to talk today about how to accessibility if you're mostly on the back end. And as a longtime Rubyist, all my examples are in Ruby, and so this is a good crowd for that. So let's get started. My name is Hilary Stohs-Krause. I'm a senior software engineer at Red Canary. We're a cybersecurity startup based out of Denver. I'm a very neglectful gardener. I pretty much only plant native perennials because they don't really need me. And I'm the kind of person who dresses up when I go to the Renaissance Fair every summer. So this is from last summer. I went as a fairy with very anatomically incorrect wings, but what do you do? So what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to have a little bit of an intro. Then we're going to talk about what do we mean by the word accessibility. Then we're going to get into some specifics with the code, including APIs and specs, and then also general practices. And then we're going to do a quick wrap up. So first, why are we here, right? Why do backend devs even need to care about accessibility? We typically think about external users, right? So does our UI have good color contrast? Can you navigate it with your keyboard? Things like that. But there's also internal users, right? There's all of us and our coworkers. So 16% of people globally have some kind of disability. 20% of people have dyslexia. And 8% of men are colorblind, right? And this isn't just older people. I think sometimes we think, oh, as you get older, you might have memory issues or mobility issues. 1 in 12 adults under 35 have a disability. So this means there's a strong chance at least one of your coworkers could benefit from accessibility practices. The best part, too, is that this isn't just about people who maybe have different needs or disabilities. Accessibility improvements benefit everyone. And we're going to take a look at a couple of examples. So who here uses an Alexa or Google Home or something like that? People want to just put their hands in the, whatever the way you do it. Yeah, see a couple. Okay. So the first full text-to-speech synthesizer was invented in 1976 to help the blind community. How many people listen to audiobooks? First one was recorded, I thought this was really cool. The first one was recorded in 1932 on a record by the American Foundation for the Blind. And how many people use an electric toothbrush? This one usually gets the most, yeah, right? Yeah. Those were invented in 1954 for people with limited motor skills. So even if you don't use one of these, right, you almost certainly know someone who does, who doesn't need it, right? It just makes our lives easier. It gives us a benefit. And even if some of these do have more, what you might consider a neutral impact for most people, adhering to accessibility standards is more and more commercially or legally required, not even just about doing the right thing. So what do we mean by accessibility, right? When we hear it, we likely think about making things usable for people with disabilities, but what is a disability? So this is what the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, this is how they define disability. Any condition of the body or mind that makes it more difficult for someone to do certain activities and interact with the world around them. So this is a very broad definition. And we're going to be kind of going at this definition, not necessarily what constitutes a legal disability. We're going to take this sort of wider perspective on it in this talk. So what are some states that would fall under, benefiting from accessibility? Long-term disability. So these are things like blindness, ADHD, paralysis, right? These are kind of the things I think we default to when we think about disability. There's also what are considered temporary disabilities. So you broke your arm, you have pneumonia, you were in a car accident and have whiplash, right? These are states that we expect to change. Oh yeah, someone said poor bird. It took me forever. Maybe I'm just a bad prompt engineer, but it took me forever to get a bird with a broken arm who didn't have yet another wing. They kept giving me 3 wings. So the broken wing, the regular wing, and then another wing. Anyway. And apart from kind of those temporary and more permanent disabilities, there are also experiences or conditions, right? Going back to that definition from the CDC, that can make things more challenging. So what are some examples of those? You don't know any coworkers who have a different first language than the rest of the team, who are earlier in their career, who have a baby at home, right? They're not getting a lot of sleep. They're pretty stressed out. They use a different tech stack in their current role than they have in previous jobs. These are all conditions of the body or mind that make it more difficult to do certain activities. And I think we want everyone on our teams to feel supported and included, and we want to minimize struggle wherever possible. And I think that's kind of a key thing here is we're not trying to, it's really hard, especially as like an individual contributor, to like make it to bring equity in the sense like everyone has the same ability to do their job in the same way, right? But we're just trying to minimize struggle. And so that's really what we're gonna look at in this talk. So this is a person who's a software engineer at AWS who over time has been having more and more limited vision. So they started their programming career with full vision, and I believe it was a genetic situation. They're now losing vision over time. And they said, we make our products accessible, in some cases, but not the processes by which they are built. So our development practices themselves are inaccessible. So like I said, we're going to talk about kind of two main areas here, the code itself and then general practices. But if there's literally one thing you take away from this talk, maybe you have a baby at home, right? Maybe you're not able to like fully engage, totally fine. If you take one thing away from this talk, avoid abbreviations. When we don't use abbreviations, we're decreasing the need for context or interpretation. We're preventing confusion and misunderstanding. This is something someone actually said to me in my first week at Red Canary. Can you bug TSC to connect with the CSM about AWS and CB? And now I know what that means. And I don't have to think about it. But at the time, I was just like totally lost, felt like an imposter, no idea what's going on. Like, let's just not do it. Just don't use abbreviations. They really, the benefits do not outweigh the harm. All right, going into our code, let's take a look at how we can improve accessibility in our code through readability, naming, and linters. So first, readability. We want to have a balance between meaning and length. So a lot of things we're going to talk about, right? There's trade-offs. So we're looking for kind of where's the happy medium with these things. The more verbose it is, right, the easier it is to understand. Generally speaking, that's not necessarily true, again, if you have dyslexia or concentration issues. Shorter, on the other hand, right, some benefits of having shorter code is it's easier to skim. It's easier to kind of look at as a whole instead of parsing through each individual piece. Pronounceable words. This is one I hadn't really thought about until doing this talk. Better for screen readers, right? Screen readers are literally reading out your code. And so if we're using variable names and method names that are words, it's much better for screen readers trying to parse that. Also makes pairing easier, right? Have you ever been pairing and you're trying to read out a line of code to someone and end up just saying the letters because you can't pronounce it? Yeah. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. So this is one that I would argue is a little too short, right? And we're going to be focusing really on the variable names here. So we have failed and old. Like, yeah, that does have meaning, right? But I can't tell at a glance what failed means and what old means. Here's an example that's maybe a little more information than we need, right? So has reached max failures before finishing. I do know exactly what that means. It's very clear, but it's also super long. Next one, right? Has been running longer than acceptable. Again, super, super clear, but arguably more information than we need. And here's kind of one that's like just right. So reached max fails. Again, we're conveying the key information here, which is that it's failed more than once and we've hit some kind of maximum. Running too long, right? So old versus running too long gives us a lot more context for kind of what's happening in this code here. All right, naming. We all know naming is the hardest thing, right? The goal here really is let your code be unambiguous and self-documenting. We're going to talk about documentation in a bit. This is one of like my personal pet peeves is when people use a single letter as a placeholder in a loop or iteration. Use words, just use a word. It makes it so much easier to follow. I was working in a spec file that was like 600 lines long, and someone had done a let statement at the very top of the file for subdomain. And they said let s and then like factory bot.create subdomain. But I didn't know this. I was just trying to update one test on line like 325, and I'm just seeing S everywhere. And so then I have to go back and figure out where is S being said? What does S refer to? And if they had just put let subdomain equal subdomain, I would have known exactly what I was working with. I wouldn't have had to do this extra investigation. Choose existing method approaches that read like sentences. I think this is especially like there's special opportunities in the language like Ruby, which is meant to be kind of Englishly, right? Meant to be like we're reading text. So really lean into that because that's super helpful for a bunch of people. So here's some more examples. So this is some code I came across in our repository. CB equals message.gsub, new line, blank space. I mean, it's pretty simple. I can tell what's going on here, right? It's okay. But this is better, right? Again, we're removing the abbreviation, carbon black. Okay, cool. And message.gsub new line blank space is literally doing the same thing, like or giving you the same result as message.delete new line. But the bottom one is so much easier to read, right? It's more like a sentence. What are we doing? We're deleting new lines. Great, let's write that. All right, linters. I love linters. I used to be someone who was kind of on the fence about linters because they can be kind of annoying. And a lot of times you'll run into code bases where people are just constantly like disabling and enabling rules to get around them and not actually following the spirit of the linter. But they really can be a big boost for accessibility. So why? What makes your code consistent? And I would argue, more importantly, predictable. The rules are written down for everyone to reference. So if you're, coming to like Ruby as an example, if you're coming to Ruby at a job for the first time and you're not sure what sort of the standards are and the conventions, you can just go look it up. It makes it so that there's no surprises, there's no secrets, like it's transparent. It just makes it a much more level playing field, no matter where kind of your familiarity with Ruby or programming is. For example, at Red Canary, we use a ton of linters. We have Rubocop, Hamlint, ESLint, Adelint, SCSSlint, and it's great. It just makes everything. It also takes some of the subjectivity out of PR review because we already have the rules that we've all decided on and agreed to follow, and it happens automatically. So someone doesn't have to come in and say, oh, hey, actually, this is kind of hard to read. What if you did it this way instead? Because it's happening in our pipeline before we even get to people looking at the code. All right, some general tips for our code to make it accessible. Line length, everyone's favorite, right? Generally speaking, we want to be between 75 to 100 characters. I think the Rubocop default, for example, for line length is 100 characters, and there are reasons for that. We read best between like, I want to say it's like 50 to 75 characters. Like we literally read best for that. New York Times, for example, their line length doesn't go above 74 characters per line. And that's a website that's literally just meant if you're intended to consume big blocks of text, right? That's just how we read best. More and shorter lines of code is also better for screen readers, generally. And when I talk about screen readers, one caveat I want to make is that there are a lot of ways that people can tweak their screen reader setup to their preferences. So screen reader stuff tends to be very general. Someone asked me after I gave this talk, oh, well, I've heard that camel case is way better for screen readers than snake case. And it depends. I think it was two or three of the top 4 do much better with camel case than snake case, but one of them doesn't. And so unfortunately it's hard to come up with really hard lines and rules for screen readers for some of the more detailed stuff. Shorter lines of code is also better for people with dyslexia or concentration disorders, right? Instead of having to like read all the way across the screen and try to remember what was at the beginning, you can see it kind of all in one view and it's easier to process. Indentation. So this is another one, right? We were looking for a balance. So linters are going to recommend certain things. Other things are actually better for people. You're really just trying to find something that kind of rides in the middle. Yeah, all about balance. This was that was interesting. You know, we're talking about screen readers, and people are sometimes like, well, I don't know any programmers who use a screen reader to program, right? But actually, according to Stack Overflow's programmer survey from 2023, almost 1 in 50 developers are blind or have vision issues. And this is a spectrum, right? So like I have a coworker who is a little older, and when I just know whenever we pair to like magnify my screen a couple times if I'm going to be screen sharing, because it just makes it easier for him. And I don't know that he would identify as having vision issues, but he prefers when the text is bigger. And again, this is a spectrum, right? That one, the developer Julia, who we saw a quote from her earlier, right? People lose visual acuity over time. So some of this isn't necessarily about what does my team need right now, but anticipating like what might future team members need, or what might I need in the future, and how do we just kind of make it easier for everyone. So some more examples. So this is fine. There's a lot of white space at the beginning. And again, depending on how you have your screen reader set up, some just skip that, some don't. This, I would argue, is a little bit better. We've got all of our arguments in a row. We've got a smaller indentation. You're not having to do as much like back and forth scanning. You know, if you had a whole form with ones like this where it was a wider indentation, you're doing a lot of kind of moving across like this instead of being able to kind of skim more in a straight line. And you might be thinking to yourself, like, I get that this could help people, but I really hate how it looks. Like that just bothers me on a deep personal level. And I totally get that. But while preference is personal, accessibility is global. And so the analogy I like to use is, imagine if you were in an office and you had to sit in this super hard, uncomfortable chair that had like weird spikes on the arms, and it was too short for you, and there were no wheels. And you had to use that every day just because your office manager thought they looked cool, right? You could do it, but it would be adding unnecessary challenge to your work, right? Just let people pick their own chairs. We're going to talk about that in a little bit too. Comments is one of my hot takes. I think comments are amazing and broadly underutilized. And I know there's that old truism, right? That like, oh, good code doesn't need comments. But why not both, right? Clean, readable code and helpful contextual comments. So what are some situations where comments can be especially helpful? Let's take a look at a few. When you expect to change the code in the near future, if it concerns mission critical functionality, like maybe you might think, oh, well, this is obvious what's happening here, but if changing this even a little bit could break a whole bunch of shit, just make that obvious, right? Changing the code could have unintended consequences. So I actually had this happen in a PR recently. It was a partial with like, we had multiple partials at different levels with a similar name, and I was changing one of them. And I was like, oh, this is only being used in this one email. Great, I'm fine. But it turned out it was actually being used on a random table somewhere else. And no one realized it because when we made the change, we also realized that that table itself was super out of date. So this is just a page people had been kind of forgotten about. And so now there is a comment in that partial that says, hey, this is also used here. Make sure you test both places if you change it. And then if the code is particularly complex or complicated, right? This is often the main area or the main reason why we would put comments in, because it's just, there's complicated stuff going on. And this isn't just for other people, right? Like obviously this is beneficial for early career folks or maybe newer hires who aren't as familiar with the code base. But this is also great for you in 6 months when you have completely forgotten why you made the changes you made, right? So if not for anyone else, like do it for you. And then this is another key one that I think we're really good about at Red Canary is leaving comments if there's code that relates to an external service or vendor. So like hitting an API or relying on a field that's being set, somewhere else by an external service. Like that's a great time to leave a comment. So here's an example. The comment just says, this one-off is a placeholder to fix an immediate client issue with ragdolls. Although I don't know who would have an issue with ragdolls. It will be replaced in Jira ticket 12345. And so this comment acknowledges, hey, this is kind of an anti-pattern. We have a reason for that. it's going to be fixed. And then they let the person kind of follow the path to see, okay, where is this going to be fixed? How, why, etc. All right, APIs. I will say this was a hard talk to put together. It was more challenging than I expected to find information about best practices for accessibility with a lot of this kind of thing. So API development, we're a little sparse. This was the best I could find. But if anyone has anything to add or knows more about this, like definitely hit me up. I would love to expand this section if possible. So what are some ways that in our code we can make our API development more accessible? Using consistent descriptive fields, right? The best kind of API is one where you're not sure, like you know what information you want, you're not entirely sure what route is available, but you make an educated guess based on other routes, and it just works, right? Isn't that just magical? That's like the best feeling. Make your APIs like that. Make them like guessable. Using word separators. I thought this one was interesting. This is a case where underscores are much better than just like looping it together, right? So like active underscore file underscore type instead of active file type. This is not only, again, beneficial for screen readers, but also people whose primary language isn't the language your API is written in, or who are in a hurry, or, right? Just being consistent with that. Again, abbreviations, no good. Don't do it. And this, I think, is an area where it's very easy to do abbreviations. So some examples, right? Spell it out. So external service instead of ext service. Previous instead of pre. Prev is one that I see a lot, right? Next and pre. I'm like, oh, they're both 4 letters. That's nice. No, just write out previous. Just do it. All right, and then if you're using a documentation generator or generating your own documentation for your API, making sure that your UI is accessible. So, for example, we use I knew I was going to forget this because I didn't put it in my notes. Whatever the one we use is that we use to Swagger. We use Swagger to generate our API docs over at Canary. And this is what it looks like for full color vision on the docs that are generated. And this is an example if you're colorblind. And you can see that it's a lot harder to see the distinctions between some of the different methods, right? Get, post, etc. So that's another thing to consider is like, okay, well, if you can get the data, great. But to get the data, often you need to read the documentation. If you can't read the documentation, it's that much harder to get the data. And then we're going to talk more about documentation in a little bit. Specs and testing. How do we make our specs and testing more accessible? So high test coverage, right, serves itself as built-in documentation, which makes our code base kind of literally more accessible to people because they have more than one way to kind of dig into it, learn more about it, get familiar and comfortable with it. Test coverage and documentation, these are also great for a variety of focus or concentration issues, right? Same rules apply that we've talked about above, right? Use semantic naming, avoid abbreviations, etc. I already told my story about my subdomain issue in that massive spec file. Like, just spell it out. And then this is one that I really like to talk about is like writing your test to tell a story. Because I've had situations where I'm working on a new part of the code base, and the first thing I'll do is I'll go look at the specs and be like, okay, well, what's currently happening here? To give me kind of like an overview of the code that I'm about to work in. And it's really hard to get that overview if the files are, like if your tests are in kind of a random order. If it's like, oh, we've got a few for scopes here, and then we do some for methods, and then we've got some for like an association. Oh, and then here's some more spec one or scope ones. Like, no. Make your specs tell a story, right? Go in a narrative order. So often this is similar to the order that the code is written in the file that you're testing, right? So if you have scopes at the top in your file, put scopes at the top, scope tests at the top of your spec file, right? Just kind of follow a similar order. Be descriptive. So I really love using, like we use RSpec, and I context the shit out of my spec files. Like, context, when here's some more information that you might need to know, then it does this. Context, when here's some more information you might need to know, it does this. And and putting a lot of specs in, right? Especially if we're talking about like back-end tests, which tend to be a lot less, generally, right? So general tend to be a lot less, like have fewer performance issues than if we're doing like UI tests. Testing positive and negative assumptions, testing edge cases, just put it all in there. So then when I go, like, I love when I come to a spec file and it's like, okay, when this situation is true, it returns false if this thing has happened. It returns true if this thing has happened. It returns false if this thing and this thing have happened. It returns, throws this type of error if you pass in hot garbage. Like, great. I just want to see what is everything going on here. And it also tells me, it makes me more confident that we have thought about all of this before. And that if I make changes, the test will catch them if I break something. It makes me so much more nervous to change code with low spec coverage because I might break things that I don't even know exist and we won't find out until it gets to production. Spell out positive and negative assumptions. And then, of course, you can also write tests to measure accessibility measures in the UI. So here's my hot take for code. Damp tests are the new dry. So quick shout out to Amanda Boehner for introducing me to this idea in a blog post. This is from that post. If our test suite takes too long for a newcomer to understand, it's a strain on velocity. If our team members don't feel confident updating it, it's a product liability. So one example of how do we write damp tests, damp is descriptive and meaningful phrases versus dry, which is don't repeat yourself, right? So of course, as we've been saying this entire presentation, it's a balance. One example that I like to think about is I hate when I'm running a test suite, and again, this is our specific, but that uses shared examples. And so you end up with failures that are like, this file.rb, and then it's like bracket 1, bracket 3, bracket 4, comma, bracket, and you have no idea which one actually failed. And you have to like do a find to figure out where the actual, I hate that. It's so annoying. So I personally am not really a fan of shared examples. I think there are some, there are exceptions, of course. One way that I really like that shared examples were used is I had a colleague who wrote a spec file, used shared examples, but he defined the examples in the spec file. And so it was super easy to follow it, super easy to debug. It didn't end up with like this spaghetti of a spec code. So deepen meaningful phrases. Documentation. So we're going to talk about documentation kind of from a higher level here. One thing that I don't have in a slide, but that I like to call out is documentation is only as valuable as it is up to date, right? And it's so easy for us to write documentation for like a new feature we just built and then forget about it for 4 months. So one of the ways that I like to, at least for documentation that I've written, that I try to mitigate that is I have a repeating calendar event once a month on a Friday at like 2 p.m. my time for half an hour. And it's just a link to any documentation in we use Confluence, any documentation in Confluence that I have touched. And I just kind of quickly skim through and I look and I see like, oh, have I learned more about this thing since I last touched this? Or have we changed a process related to this since I last touched it? Is there a new documentation we've written that's related that I could like backlink to in this older page? All right, so first there are kind of what I would consider more traditional accessibility concerns, right? So don't use images of text or code samples or terminal output, right? And I think we're all like, oh, I wouldn't do that, but we're in a hurry and maybe we think we'll come back and change it later and we forget to. There is nothing more frustrating than being like, oh, I need to collect some client data, for sales. And we've done this before. And there's a script in Confluence. I'll just go to the script in Confluence and I'll copy the script. But the script is an image and you can't copy it. It's the worst. Don't do it. Just put the actual text. And sometimes people are like, oh, well, our documentation engine like isn't great about code highlighting. Cool. Then put the image and the actual text, right? Give people both options for how they want to engage with it. Making sure your color choices have high enough contrast, right? And making sure you check in light and dark mode, because not all like engines are good about doing that the same. And then using semantic hierarchical HTML, right? And you can do that whether it's Markdown, WYSIWYG, straight code. And that last one especially, right, that doesn't only help with screen readers, but it also helps to skim. And if you have a documentation system that auto-generates table of contents, right, it's pulling from that hierarchical HTML. So again, these practices help everybody in a variety of ways. And then including captions or transcripts or video documentation. And this is one that, like, I recognize that there can be barriers to enacting some of these, right? One of the things that we've just kind of started to do at Red Canary, because we have a lot of video presentations, is like older ones where we're not engaging in like live captioning, is we play it while having a Zoom open and have Zoom do the live transcription. And honestly, it works pretty well. So we've been starting to kind of back transcript some of our video documentation. The other thing about this too is, you know, these aren't just accessibility concerns in the sense of disability, but it also allows people to engage with the content in whatever way is best for them, right? So some people are visual learners, some people are oral learners, some people really like video, you know, some people want to read a transcript while listening to a video. And so this really gives people multiple ways to learn in whatever way is best for them. Oh, it looks like I turned off my automation. Okay, well, simple writing. So simple writing is something I wasn't super familiar with, again, until I kind of researched for this talk, but it's kind of what it sounds like. People also call it like plain writing or plain language, and it's being as concise as possible without losing clarity. So one thing I like to bring up with this one is more than 1 in 10 programmers in Stack Overflow's 2022 survey said they have a concentration or memory disorder. That's like more than 10% of programmers have a concentration or memory disorder. Or if you're on call in the middle of the night, we were talking about on call earlier, right? If you're on call in the middle of the night and something goes wrong, your ability to consume large blocks of text is probably diminished. And when it's hard to concentrate or to recall information or to process new information, you're extra relying on documentation to help you solve problems and answer questions. So how do we do simple writing? Gonna move forward with that one. So avoiding ampersands. This is like a really small thing, but honestly, most of this talk is really small things, right? It's not saying overhaul your entire code base. It's just saying, hey, next time you add a loop, you use a word instead of a letter, right? But ampersands are apparently like screen readers get cranky with those. Keep your sentences short. So we talked about this very similarly with our line length for our code, right? We said 74 to 100 characters going across, but there's a similar concept when we're talking about how long our sentences are. So even if it's only 74 characters in a line, you still don't want 3 or 4 74 character lines in a row that are all one sentence, right? So they done testing on this. And they found when the average sentence length is 14 words, readers understand more than 90% of what they're reading. So they're still missing a little bit, but they understand more than 90%. If you go up to 43 words, comprehension drops to less than 10%. And honestly, 14 words is not, or it's really not that many. So making our sentences shorter than we think they need to be really helps with reading comprehension. And then you can test the reading level of your text or get AI suggestions for simplifying it, right? This doesn't have to be like a lot of extra work. You can write it the way you normally would, plug it into an engine, and it'll tell you, okay, you're using too many adverbs, or you could swap out this word for one that's simpler. And there's a lot of different ones we can use for that. So Hemingway is my personal favorite, but it is English only. Language Tool does up to 30 languages, but it does have kind of a paywall. Yeah, I just saw Jade suggested Hemingway. Yeah, it's great. Paraphrase Tool has more than 100 languages, and there is a free tier. I think you're limited on how many times you can use it or how many sentences you can put in, something like that at a time. But these are great ways to kind of lean into that plain or simple language. So here's an example from Hemingway. So I put in some documentation from Red Canary, and it's calling out different ways that I could improve that. So 4 of 13 sentences are hard to read. And a couple of those are because they have links, but as we're going to see, I shouldn't have straight URLs in there because they are hard to read. It's telling me where I could probably get rid of some passive voice, where I have phrases that have simpler alternatives. And so making this kind of a step in your documentation writing process helps make sure that it's accessible for a wider variety of people. Some additional tips and tricks, documentation. So like I just said, link text. Link text should be informative, not click here. Or we're going to see an example of that in a second. Write your dates and times in unambiguous ways. So I gave this talk at Helvetic Ruby in Zurich, and I think a lot of people there are on teams with Americans and just laughed really hard when I did this part. May 10th, right? Is it 5/10 or is it 10/5? It just depends where you're from. But if you have to guess, that's bad because someone's gonna guess wrong. And then avoid using socially charged terms for technical concepts. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with accessibility? Again, if we're trying to minimize struggle, if we're trying to create environments where everyone can thrive and be successful, that's really hard for some folks to do if we're using terms like these. And so I'm going to give a couple of examples. These are American English examples, but I think some of them, because a lot of tech is in English, kind of permeate wider than that. But I'm sure wherever you're located, you can think of ones that would apply for your context and culture. So allow list versus whitelist, right? We want to be using allow list. Main instead of master. Core feature instead of native feature. And again, these are all pretty small things, but we all know that small things add up into big things over time. So here's an example. So the top one is okay, right? Click here to learn more about changes to native features coming 6/12/2025. But there's ambiguity here. Where am I going when I click here? If I click on click here, where is it going to take me? Is it taking me to more internal documentation? Is it taking me to the code? Is it taking me to external documentation? Like, where am I going with that? Again, 6/12, is that December 6th or is that June 12th? Kind of makes a big difference if we're talking about new features coming. And then we have the better example, right? You can learn more about the changes to core features coming June 12th, 2025 in the vendor documentation. So when I click on this link, I instantly know, okay, I'm going to the vendor documentation. Perfect. Removing ambiguity. And then there's some about kind of overall communication. So being careful of assuming cultural context, watching for gender assumptions or exclusion. Please, everyone, if you haven't, add your pronouns and name pronunciation to your profile in Slack or Teams or whatever you use. And then also make sure you're checking other people's. So I have a coworker and his name is spelled Xiao. And I had been pronouncing it Xiao because that's what I remembered him telling me when we first met, like Xiao. Okay, great. But I kept hearing people in meetings saying Zhao. So I thought, oh shit, have I been saying it wrong this whole time? And like, I didn't want to ask him because I'm sure he gets asked a lot. So I went to his Slack profile and he had his pronunciation there. And it turns out I was right. It was Xiao. So everybody else was making an assumption. Maybe they knew someone who pronounced it that way. Maybe they misheard it the first time. But it'd be so easy to clear up by just checking his profile and seeing how he pronounced it. So if you haven't added yours, please do. And then avoiding phrases like it should be easy, right? Because what's easy to you is not easy to somebody else for a whole variety of reasons, right? Some disability related, right? If you have a concentration disorder, things that are hard for you might be easier for someone else, and things that are easier for you might be hard for somebody else. If you're a newer programmer, if you like all of these reasons, right? There's so many reasons why your easy is not somebody else's easy. So I like to say things like, I think it's pretty straightforward, but hit me up if you run into any issues. Or I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think you're just going to need these 2 files and it should be all contained in there, right? Or if I remember correctly, we have good test coverage for this, but let me know if you hit a snag. So trying to be more specific about why we think it will be less challenging and like telling them resources for it, but also assuming that it will be hard and opening that path for someone to then come back and be like, oh, hey, actually, I looked at that file and we have really shitty tests haven't been updated in 2 years. So I'm going to need some more guidance. Like, cool. All right. And then real quick, we're going to talk about general engineering policies. These are beyond obvious ones like gender neutral paid family leave or having a wheelchair accessible building, right? And we're going to focus specifically on policies that tend to relate to engineering organizations. So how do we empower people to work effectively? Flexible work schedules. This is a huge one, right? I think after the pandemic, we're all aware of how much this can benefit folks. Choosing vendors and tools that prioritize accessibility. So you could have the most accessible code base at your company, but if your vendor for documentation and for support tickets and, you know, for whatever have you, like if all of your external or your like HR software for payment, right? If all of that is inaccessible, you don't have an accessible working environment, right? Providing education and training on how to support colleagues with disabilities, because the onus should not be on them to teach others, right? We should just be educating ourselves. And then offering folks a variety of tools to get the job done. So this is one that I hadn't really thought about until I was researching this talk, but there's a great quote I want to share. Tools like K9s can make using Kubernetes more accessible for individuals with dyslexia or colorblindness than using kubectl. Allowing developers to customize their setup to their preferences is a crucial aspect of enhancing accessibility. And so again, there's always trade-offs, right? Because a trade-off here might be, oh, well, if everyone's using the same code editor, then it's easier to debug issues. Or when we're pairing, we're all familiar with the setup. And that's all true. But I would argue that whenever possible, it's better to let people pick according to their preferences than to enforce strict guidelines about what people have to use. All right, so wrap up. Most of the work for accessibility, right, on the back end comes from small individual efforts. We're not talking about some huge overhaul. We're just trying to be more deliberate about the code that we write, the documentation we write, the APIs and specs that we write. Changes to make products or processes easier to use benefit everyone. And this is the big one. Even if you rarely touch the UI, like I know in my current role, I'm hardly ever doing things in the front end, you can still have a big impact on accessibility for your colleagues and your coworkers. And then avoid abbreviations, please. One of the 4 core values at Red Canary is to be kind and authentic. And I think that applies here, right? Striving for accessible working environments is just the right thing to do for our colleagues. So thank you. And I have a bunch of citations. And then I've got my email. And also we're hiring. So if you're looking for a job, redcanary.com/job openings. I'm happy to chat with anyone about what it's like to work there.